Hello, fellow book lovers, both readers and writers. I am Matty Dalrymple, and I write the Endkinder suspense novels and suspense shorts and Lizzie Ballard thrillers. And I also write, speak, and consult on the writing craft and the publishing voyage and share what I learn on the Indie Author Podcast. And you can find out more about me at mattydalrymple.com and at theindieauthor.com. And this is my video series, What I Learned, where I ask authors 2 questions related to their latest book. What did they learn from the book that they'd like to share with their fellow authors? And what did they learn from their latest book that they'd like to share with their fellow readers? And I am here today with Kristina Adams. Hey, Kristina, how are you doing?
Hey, Matty, I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. To give our viewers a little bit of background on you, Kristina Adams is the author of 17 novels, 3 books for writers, and too many blog posts to count. She publishes mother-daughter ghost stories as KC Adams. When she's not writing, she's playing with her lovely dog, inflicting cooking experiments on her boyfriend, or attempting to keep the contents of her greenhouse alive. And her latest book, The Mean Girls Murder, is launching soon, or has already launched, depending on when you see this video. And so today I'm asking Kristina the 2 What I Learned questions about The Mean Girls Murder, and we're going to start out with, what did you learn from your latest book that you'd like to share with your fellow authors?
So, what I would like to share with fellow authors is that it doesn't matter how long you've been publishing for. There will be some books that are more difficult than others, some books that kind of twist you out of shape, and you come out the other side very different, and you might even feel a little bit drained. And I say that because Mean Girls Murder is my 20th book. And when I first wrote it last summer, well, I sent it to beta readers last summer, and some were nicer than others about it, but the general consensus was what I'd got didn't work. And I had done a completely different plotting process for this book. It was quicker to write, it was easier to write, and it was because I was taking for granted, I think, the fact that this was the next the first 4 books are a complete arc in the Afterlife Calls series, and then book 5 kind of is like the aftermath, if you will, if you're structuring it like a novel. Book 4 was the climax, and this is them dealing with what happens after. So I tried to do something a little bit slower, a little bit more cutesy, and it just didn't work. And I thought about how my arc readers would feel, and I was like, you know what? I could kind of see them saying the same thing as these beta readers. I've got to change it. And that was horrible. It was a horribly uncomfortable feeling to be this far into my journey and to have to do the exact same thing with this book that I had to do with my very first book that I did in 2015. And so what I did was I slowed down a bit. I pushed the publication date back because I originally wanted to publish this around Halloween. And then I really thought about, okay, how can I push this further? How can I use what I've already built and then build on it? So I changed who the antagonist was and increased the stakes for the characters. I changed some of the subplots. I think there's only 1 subplot that remains of the original, and I've got 4 kind of key characters in the series who all have their own different things going on. Oh no, there's 2 that stayed the same actually, but how they tied to the main plot changed. And so it took a lot of rewrites, and I would say maybe 20% of the original stayed, if that. And it ended
Wow.
up being it ended up being the longest book in the Afterlife Calls series as well, because they're kind of short novels mostly. This one is much more, it's not a long novel. It's not as long as What Happened in London, my longest book, which is 120,000. This one's 70 to 75, I think. And I worked so hard on this book. I kept thinking, how can I push my characters further? How can I tie it to this? How can I tie it to that? And I was just pushing and pushing myself physically and mentally. And it took all of my creative energy. Because what I'd planned to do after I published the 4th book, The Witch's Sacrifice, was take a break, actually, from publishing. And I couldn't do that because I had to finish The Mean Girls Murder because I'd already got the pre-order dates at this point set up. And so I was like, well, okay, I've got until the end of March. What can I do? And the ideas started percolating in the back of my mind. And I got there, and the reviews have been insane. Readers have said it was my best book ever. And these are people who've been following my journey, not quite from the beginning, but for a very, very long time. You know, we're talking probably 4 or 5 years now. But it did take a lot out of me. And actually, once I had finished the book, I had so much more creative energy to do other things. Like I'm redesigning the covers for the What Happens in Hollywood universe. That's 14 covers. And I've been trying to get other people to do it, but they never quite get the essence of the books. But now I have creative energy to design my own covers again. And writing doesn't feel like an obligation anymore. It feels fun because I've got nothing on pre-order. I can just play with it. I can play with the characters, and I want to go back to those worlds rather than feeling like I have to. And I think that's the real problem that you can get stuck in if you've been publishing for a long time and if you were publishing regularly. Because I was doing one book every 3, 4, 5 months since about 2019. And at the time, it was a coping mechanism for me to get away from my grief after I lost my grandparent, to get away from my chronic pain, my fatigue, and all these things. But there comes a point when actually you have to accept those things and just be present rather than chasing the next goal. And for me, that being present and accepting that this is a journey, there is no destination except that gravestone at the end, as a lot of my characters come to realize. I make it sound like I kill a lot of people. I don't kill a lot of my characters, honest. Actually, half of them are dead because they're ghosts. So
It comes
before
with
the
the
book starts.
territory.
Yeah, it does. And to be fair, most of them are dead before the story starts. So, it's not me technically that did it. It's the backstory. But yeah, there is no end point. If you are present in the journey, I think it is a lot more comfortable and you put a lot less pressure on yourself, because there is this thing called the arrival fallacy where you think, when I've just done this thing, my life will be better, everything will be happier. And then you reach the goal, whether that's publishing your first book or your 20th, and you feel quite low because you spent so much time and energy on this goal. You've almost had blinkers on, and the blinkers are removed, and then it's, well, what next?
Yeah.
And I really got that with my first book, and I got it a little bit with this book as well, but I learned to kind of just accept that it's a thing, because I've had it from quite a few of my books now, especially when I have taken that time to slow down. Even if I know what's going to happen next, I've got like 10 books planned in this series. It's not like this is the last one, but it's given me time and headspace to think and to kind of be kinder to myself and not just be like the Energizer Bunny. I'm not the Energizer Bunny. I have chronic fatigue syndrome. I cannot be an Energizer Bunny. But I try and do that to try and get away from some of the things in my life, particularly going on in my head. So giving myself that break and being kind has actually made a massive difference. And like I said, given me more creative energy to do other things that when I was just, I don't want to call it going through the motions, but I guess stuck in the trap of rapid release, it just left me with no energy for other things. And that's what I'm really trying to do this year, is break out of a lot of those traps and be like, well, just because this is what everyone else is doing, that doesn't mean it's what I have to do or what's right for me.
It's interesting because we're recording this on April 10th, 2023, and the podcast episode that will go out tomorrow is Claire Taylor talking about Enneagram for authors. And she spent quite a lot of time talking about rapid release and how people get sucked into it, but how, depending on the type of personality you have, it can be, can be very energizing or it can be very draining. So it's interesting to hear that perspective, right? Having edited Claire's interview about that.
Yeah, for me, it's a bit of both, depending on how I'm feeling. But the problem is, it just wasn't sustainable for me because the kind of books I write are very emotional. And so it leaves me emotionally drained. And if I'm doing that constantly, I've got nothing left for the people in my life, for myself, next book, for my client work. And I've had to come to realize I can't rely on my books as my sole source of income because it takes too much out of me emotionally. And if I slow down, then I can continue to put those emotions into the book without them draining me as much as they have done.
Well, I wanted to ask one more question about from the author side before we launch into the reader side, even though you gave me a great entree with that line. But you had said that you had tried a different plotting approach. Do you feel like that was what led you to have to do so much rework on it? In addition to the fact that you were trying for a different tone, it sounds like maybe a little bit more lighthearted tone with this book?
No, I think I was trying to force a particular type of antagonist into the world that didn't fit the reader expectations. I had increasingly been increasing the stakes of the last 4 books, and book 5 lowered them too much. And so the characters weren't at risk anymore. And they are the kind of characters that are at risk in every book because they have powers that are very highly coveted. So someone is pretty much always targeting one of them. And in this book, there wasn't that, and it was too easy for them to defeat the antagonist. And because of that, it just wasn't satisfying for the readers. I hadn't pushed them hard enough, basically. And that is one of my mantras is how much further can I push my characters? And I have found that the books where I do push my characters harder, whether that is emotionally or physically or a combination of the two usually for me. I like to put my characters in hospital, not like some sort of schadenfreude, but just, that was just my childhood. A lot of injured people and a lot of sick people. So it's just coming through. And yeah, so I think keeping in mind that I hadn't pushed the characters hard enough, that was really the feedback that I got on it. It wasn't the plotting technique because the plotting technique was actually more in depth than what I'd used before. And I've continued to use it for future books and it's worked. The future ones that I'm writing now, it was just a case of when I did that outline, I wasn't thinking enough about making this. No, let me think about how to phrase that better. I was shoehorning in the antagonist rather than creating something that worked in the world. And what I actually needed to do was create a new antagonist rather than use existing mythology and include that. So what I did was I took the basis of the original that I had used and then rewrote everything. Completely changed the antagonist backstory, who they were, what their goals were. So you can see why it was so much rewriting because I was literally changing everything. One of the characters is ill in the book and I changed why she's ill and what's causing it. I added a subplot for one of the other characters that foreshadows stuff that's coming later. So there was a lot to juggle and I hadn't juggled it enough or foreshadowed enough in the earlier version. And now that I've got a clearer idea of what happens in 6, 7, 8, and even 9, I can foreshadow a lot more.
So that's a good entree again to talking about what you learned that you wanted to share with your fellow readers, because we're obviously primarily concerned with the reader's experience of this book. So talk a little bit about that side of the what I learned question.
I think for me, it's about reader satisfaction. And when you're writing something, you've got to remember that readers are coming on this journey with you and they're going to feel more satisfied. Like I say, if A, you push your character as hard as possible, and B, it is your main character who takes down whoever that antagonist is, or finds a compromise with the antagonist, depending on your genre, because in romance it's a bit different, obviously, but they're still kind of again working against each other. And I think for readers, sometimes if you binge things really quickly, you don't always realize that you've actually got a little piece of someone in your hands when you're reading that book. And regardless of what book or genre you are reading, remembering that and how hard someone has worked, even if it's not a book of your taste, is really important. Because there are books I haven't finished, there are books I haven't liked. Aside from when they really, 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 really annoy me, I don't say anything, I just shout them. I might have a rant to a friend or two, but I know how hard that author worked, and I'm not going to publicly badmouth them, especially if they're an indie doing things on their own with very little help, because I appreciate that they are working hard, and they are working harder than your average person. They are sacrificing their free time. They are sacrificing time with their loved ones, time on their own physical and mental health. And so appreciating that and going, okay, look, this isn't my kind of book, but I'm not going to leave this really terrible review just because I'm having a bad day. And that is what I've found a lot of negative reviews is that they're a form of projection. If you don't like a book, that's fine. Just say, look, this isn't my cup of tea. But I found a lot of negative reviews are actually really mean and don't need to be that mean. Just say, if you really want to leave a review, just say, not my thing because of XYZ. Don't go off on a tirade at the author because they're working harder than you can possibly imagine. There's a way to do it in terms of giving constructive feedback so that the author can improve their next book.
Yeah.
And there's a way to do it where you are just being mean, being blunt. And if you are really writing a long review about why you hate something, you've got to sit down and ask yourself, okay, why am I leaving this review? And it's, I think, because, we look like faceless entities, but we're not. We're people We have feelings. We've given a little piece of ourselves to that book that we're never going to get back. We've come out changed on the other side. And then for someone to just pour manure all over it and set it alight, it does hurt. It does.
Yeah. Well, Kristina, thank you so much for sharing the lessons you learned from the Mean Girls murder. And if people want to learn more about you as the individual that you are, please let them know where they can go to find out more about you and the Mean Girls murder and all you do online.
So my author website is KristinaAdamsAuthor.com, and that's Kristina with a K. You can also find me on Facebook. I'm there probably more than I should be. And you can find my advice for writers over at writerscookbook.com.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.